Hi there, I'm Jack.
And I'm Matt.
And this is the MindKeepers podcast.
We are an educational platform with the mission of guiding people to take the first step to addressing their mental health.
Oh, cheers, mate.
Off you go, Jack. Do a recap. This meeting is now being recorded.
Go.
I have two options when that happens. I can either continue or leave the meeting.
Right.
I could continue or I could decide to leave.
Well, I hope you continue, Max. Otherwise, that'd be just a one-man show, and that's quite tricky.
Yeah, it would be. It wouldn't be a very good podcast if I just left when it started recording.
It'd be me just talking to myself, which is never any good. So, hello and welcome to another episode of the MindKeepers podcast. Today, we're still in season 1, Anxiety Explained, but we've now moved on to episode 5, which is me and Matt discussing acute stress disorder. So again, following the typical running order of the day, myself and Matt are going to talk about what acute stress disorder is, what the symptoms are, causes are, and then also just to wrap it up, some of the treatment options as well that are available to help somebody to get through acute stress disorder. But of course, first, Matt, the important business to get out of the way. What is your number?
What is my number? For those that listen to us regularly or don't, for those who don't, who maybe have just joined, the numbers game that we play is every time me and Jack meet up, we always give ourselves a score on 1 to 10 on our mental health. 1 is I'm absolutely terrible and things are not very good for me, and then 10 is I'm absolutely brilliant and things could not be better. And it just helps me and Jack to kind of gauge how the other person is feeling, really, and how the person is feeling, which is always an interesting thing. I don't think it's something that people do regularly. You don't step back and give yourself a number or give yourself a step back and say, how am I actually feeling? So, okay. So that's the numbers. What number am I? I'm a 6, which is really an interesting thing to say, because I think that you'd think at the moment I've got a bit of holiday. I'm going away for a few days, that I would be up there in the 8s and the 9s. But I'm quite worried and anxious about the world opening up. I think that I'm going to be in an environment where I'm out with a group of good friends, but in a pub environment, in a club environment, full of crowds. And I don't know really how I'm going to react to that. I don't know how I'm going to find that, because it's been a while since I last went into a really busy environment. And so, yeah, I'd probably say a 6. So looking forward to it, a little bit excited, but also, yeah, a little bit nervous about what potentially the world is like now and how I'm going to react to being in a stuffy crowd or club. So that's my number. What about you, Jack? What's yours?
No, glad to hear you're a 6 and that you've got some time off, and obviously the stag do to look forward to as well. Sounds very fun. No, I'd say I'm pretty similar, actually. I've got the rest of the week off, but I'd say I'm about a 5 today. Probably the lowest one I've had since we've been recording the podcast. Just feeling a little bit groggy. I've been relatively high scoring recently, but yeah, just having one of them days, to be fair. I think quite similar since things have opened up a bit, just a bit of ambiguity in society at the moment. And I was at Goodwood yesterday. It just felt a bit weird to be back in crowds again. But yeah, just having a little bit of a lull day in this Thursday evening. I'll probably be bouncing back up to a good number tomorrow morning. But yeah, probably number 5, so midway. But yeah,
it's interesting that I was going to say it's interesting that you feel like that, and again, you were in quite a crowded environment yesterday, and feeling a little bit anxious about the world opening up as well.
It just felt a bit weird. Like I don't know. Just when you've been in your silo for so long, do you know what I mean? Like obviously I've been in big crowds like when I was in London recently as well, but I don't know, just seeing how some people are in crowded spaces, and yeah, it just made me feel a bit odd, I suppose. But no, I've got the cricket tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to that. At the Aegeus Bowl, the new 100 format, which is very good fun. Just going down there with my dad. That'll probably pick me up a little bit. But yeah, so about 5.
And as we know, one of the reasons why we do this is because, mental health isn't a linear thing. You can't always be up there in the tens. Like, you do have days where you don't feel as good as others. It's it's good if you're a 5, hopefully you feel a little bit better tomorrow, but being a 5 is okay.
Yeah, and it's good to keep going as well. Keep yourself occupied when you have that slump as well. But yeah, brilliant. Well, glad to hear you're well, mate. And I suppose we should crack on with the podcast. So, acute stress disorder. We'll start off, as we always do, with a nice description so we can give our listeners an idea of what acute stress disorder is. Acute stress disorder, which is also known as acute stress reaction as well, often referred to with the acronym ASD, so in the same family as PTSD, is an anxiety disorder that can develop in the first weeks after a traumatic event. It lasts at least 3 days, but can persist for up to 1 month. And ASD, acute stress disorder symptoms, express themselves in similar ways to those seen in post-traumatic stress disorder as well. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a podcast we'll be releasing in the following week. So you'll be able to see the similarities when we discuss that in that podcast as well. For your reference as well, we have also published an article on PTSD too. But in this instance, the word acute means the symptoms that develop quickly do not usually last a long time, which is the difference between acute stress disorder and PTSD. PTSD, the symptoms are often a lot more long-standing and long-term, but as well as that, the events are usually very severe, and an acute stress reaction typically occurs after the unexpected life crisis has occurred as well. So yeah, essentially acute stress disorder, quite similar to PTSD, but a shorter time frame in terms of the symptoms you have. But again, the correlation there is that it is a stress reaction to an event, to an unexpected life crisis that occurs. So that is what acute stress disorder is. Matt, I suppose a nice way to move on would be just to show what some of the symptoms are as well.
Yeah, definitely. So we do this a fair bit actually when we talk about symptoms. So there's emotional symptoms associated with acute stress disorder, and there's also some physical ones as well. So I will start with some emotional ones. So you've got psychological symptoms like anxiety, low mood, irritability, emotional ups and downs, and poor sleep, poor concentration, or wanting to be alone. You've also got things like reoccurring dreams or flashbacks, which are actually quite intrusive and quite unpleasant. Avoidance of anything that will trigger your memory of the particular stress. So avoidance is one as well, and this can also sometimes mean avoiding friends and family conversations or any situations that might just cause distress and link back to that initial trigger of the memory. Interesting in terms of how you might feel, wanting to avoid it, wanting to move away from it. And there's also reckless and aggressive behavior that may be quite self-destructive. So that's some of the sort of emotional feelings you might get.
Sorry, just a very quick one, I suppose, as well. It'd be quite interesting from the point of view, as like we always say with a lot of these podcasts, the articles that we produce, it's not just for the sufferer to learn about maybe these symptoms, but for a friend or a family member to pick up on some of these symptoms as well. So, for example, if you notice a friend, a family member, or a colleague who might be quite, avoiding certain situations, that maybe could trigger a sign that someone might be, suffering from potentially ASD. So, it's important for people to realise that and to understand that's a common symptom there.
And I think there's another element here around, they talk about symptoms around what they call dissociative symptoms, which is things like feeling numb or detached or emotionally unresponsive, reduced awareness of your surroundings, derealization. So this occurs when your environment seems strange or unreal to you. And then there's also something called depersonalization, which occurs when your thoughts or emotions don't seem real or don't seem like they belong to you, which is it must feel really, abstract, really disassociative of the world, around you. There's also something called dissociative amnesia, which occurs when you cannot actually remember one or more important aspects of the trauma or the event, which is really, it's quite interesting how that can play its way out, can't it? You think about derealization, feeling like your environment seems strange or unreal. It's a bit like...
No, I just think it rings some parallels with regards to what we've spoken about with some other disorders associated to anxiety, but also the symptoms as well. So we've spoken before about things like brain fog and not being able to think with real clarity. And you can see the kind of correlation in terms of this, in terms of there's this event that's caused so much trauma, but it can cause this kind of fuzziness and lack of mental clarity, not just associated with the memories of that traumatic event, but in terms of the aftermath as well, and how you fit into society, that kind of derealization, depersonalization. It's kind of like you're losing it's affecting your normal self. It's being quite debilitating. So yeah, I definitely feel like there are some parallels there, but that disassociated symptom, I can imagine that's a very, very tricky thing to deal with as the sufferer.
Definitely. The dissociative amnesia I find really quite interesting. How your brain can, almost, you can't remember certain aspects of it, and it's almost as though your brain in some ways is trying to protect you. It's almost like blocking out some of these distressing memories. I find that really fascinating, how the human brain works like that, how it can just, try and almost block it from your memory, really, to try and protect you in a weird kind of way.
The brain's a fascinating thing, isn't it? And it's like you say, it's like a defensive mechanism. It's like our evolution, if you like, survival. Try and block out that kind of threat, I suppose, in our own mind.
If you think it might harm you, you block it out. I find depersonalization, your thoughts and emotions don't seem real, or don't seem like they belong to you. That feels quite uncontrollable, and there's some really interesting symptoms around that, dissociative symptoms, which we know about. There's also things around physical symptoms as well. So these are caused by stress hormones such as adrenaline, which are released into the bloodstream, or by overactivity of the nervous impulses to various parts of the body. So heart palpitations, nausea, chest pains, headaches, tummy pains, breathing difficulties, all sort of signs of physical symptoms that can manifest themselves as in acute stress disorder. I think the combination of all of them together, it's quite horrific. And I think it's, you think about some going and the sort of traumatic events, which I think we'll talk about in causes, which is, some of these traumatic events, they can be very unique to a person as well in terms of what causes this. And there's so many traumatic experiences that you can have that can just onset this. I just find that the combination is quite a nasty, it feels like a nasty cocktail of things to be experiencing.
I'm just thinking from a person's point of view, if you have a mixture, like you say, a cocktail of these symptoms, so we're talking emotional, dissociative, and also physical, that's going to be so debilitating in three aspects of your life. So if you're thinking emotionally, well, if you're having, them psychological symptoms in terms of irritability, maybe some brain fog, that's going to affect the way your judgment and the decisions you make. So maybe it might affect your work life, your downtime. Having the dissociative symptoms, that might affect similarly, maybe your work life, maybe your social life as well, that kind of depersonalization and derealization. And then likewise, things like your physical symptoms, well, that might just exacerbate your physical health as well. So maybe having something like tummy or abdominal pains, that might prevent you from eating a nutritious diet because you're trying to avoid that, or having them breathing difficulties as well, you might not be able to be as active. So thinking about having a cocktail of them symptoms, how debilitating that can be and how much that could set you back in many different aspects of your life, the effects of ASD cannot be underestimated at all.
One of the things I find about acute stress disorder, which is how common it is, yet how little it's spoken about. So if we talk about some of the causes, so if you look at some of the causes, right, you've got experiencing, witness, or being faced with a traumatic event can cause a acute stress disorder, essentially. So there's some examples here, you know, like which could be something traumatic, such as a death. So you think about it, going through bereavement, for example, or a death in the family, and having to experience that can cause acute stress disorder. And that happens. We deal with bereavement in very different ways, depending on the person and how close you were to them. I find it's almost like the unspoken thing, which is where people kind of like take the time out to. It's very common to take time out when you've had when there's been a death. You know, take as much time as you need. People do that, but there's very little that talks about, well, why are they taking this time out? And I know it feels like it's you know, it's self-explanatory, but then on the other hand, you don't realize that actually that potentially the first thing people could be experiencing is an acute stress disorder, which is just a traumatic event that's really hit them hard, I think. But yet we don't talk about it in this context. We just say, oh, they're suffering a bereavement and they're off.
That's a good. It's a good example though. Bereavement's a very common one, but people, you know, some people do try and like rush back into work, don't they? It's like, oh, it's all right. You know, if I have this time out, I might think about it more and more, and it makes it worse. So I suppose it is personal to the individual, but it can be anything that has affected somebody personally. So it's not just the kind of mainstream things that might cause stress, like a bereavement or, you know, an accident or a crash. It could be absolutely anything that's causing the onset of these symptoms. I think obviously, like we've said previously as well, a common one might be something like COVID, you know, maybe losing your job or being put on furlough or having COVID itself and having that physical stress. That could cause something like this.
Definitely. Yeah. Well, if you think about it from a COVID-19 perspective, if you look at the sheer amount of change and events or what could be described as traumatic events for people, you know, you have the whole country going into a lockdown, and then with all of that you have complete change in working pattern. So actually people who have been completely ingrained with working 9 to 5 in an environment where they can see people every day and they can interact with people, and then just being completely, you know, jumping into an environment where they might be completely alone 5 days a week. And on top of that, furlough comes out, which is actually, we're going to completely make you either redundant or furlough you to the point where we don't want you to work. So actually we don't need to work. So what about that? Working 5 days a week or however long you work, you have a day job, you have a routine, and then it just gets completely kicked up, and then you're just sat there doing nothing. Think about how traumatic that must be. You must lose your sense of, you know, how many people just completely got battered from a, you know, went through a traumatic event through COVID, and then, you know, not allowed to see loved ones, being isolated from loved ones, issues around households and not being able to interact with a household, and then vulnerable people. So what about if you are caring for a vulnerable adult but you couldn't see that adult, or you have an elderly grandparent or parent who is in a care home and then you haven't been able to see them for a year? It's really traumatic. It's been a really traumatic experience, I think, COVID.
Just listening to you say that, the one that I think really stands out with COVID is derealization. I mean, obviously we were in that lockdown. That's such an unreal situation to be in, isn't it? And not seeing people and not going to work and having that social interaction. And I've listened to a lot of accounts just through the media, like on the radio the other day, that people are waking up in the morning, it doesn't feel real, does it? So we've all, if you like, had our own kind of, I suppose it depends on how you've dealt with the COVID situation, but I know from my experience that I felt that derealization on countless occasions this past 15 to 18 months with COVID. So,
Yeah.
I think just listing off these symptoms hopefully makes some people realize that what we've all been through is potentially even its own version of acute stress disorder, really.
Yeah.
So yeah, really
Some of
strong.
the other things as well, which I think are maybe a little bit more subtle, are things like relationship breakdown. So breaking down from a relationship or having a relationship breakup. I think things like that can sometimes be a little bit overlooked. Divorce, if you get a divorce and it everything's changing and it can be a bit of a traumatic. You have definitely got some of the more obvious ones. I suppose you witness someone, if you witness a person being
assaulted,
attacked, or anything like that, and that has an effect on you. And then there's some more subtle ones, which I think we don't necessarily associate with acute stress disorder, which is huge. Yeah.
I suppose we'll go on to that now then, Matt. So we've covered off some of the symptoms there, haven't we, in terms of dissociative symptoms, emotional symptoms, and also physical symptoms as well. So you move very nicely on there to what might cause it. So you just said there, experiencing, witnessing, or even being faced with a traumatic event can cause ASD. So the event, which could be something traumatic such as a death, so we've spoken about bereavement, threat of death or injury, like you've just mentioned there, that can create intense, strong fear or even helplessness as well.
Mm-hmm.
So indirect exposure may involve someone witnessing. So that was what you just mentioned there. So maybe someone witnessing assault or something like that, something happening to others or learning of something happening to close loved ones. That may lead to someone re-experiencing that traumatic event. Because obviously I think you've got that visual kind of visual memory of it, so and maybe some parts are blocked out, like that dissociative amnesia, like we've just mentioned as a symptom. So that might lead to someone avoiding things that remind them of it and having increased anxiety because of it as well. So it's interesting that there can be indirect but also direct causes of ASD. So if you've witnessed it or if you've experienced it yourself as well.
Okay. What about the treatments for ASD then? So what sort of treatments are there? And, for people experiencing this, what can you expect to have as a treatment?
Yeah, so treatments of the ASD, a doctor may use one or more of the following methods to treat someone. First of all, there's psychiatric education to teach you about your disorders. So that will be learning more about ASD, perhaps like we've just done here, Matt. I imagine that initial consultation with a psychiatric therapist maybe, or a specialist in that field will probably help the individual to understand that what they might be experiencing is ASD, probably talking through the symptoms that they have, potential cause, etc. Like always, we talk about this one quite a lot, cognitive behavioral therapy as well, CBT, which may increase recovery speed and prevent ASD from turning into PTSD. So we know that cognitive behavioral therapy, it's those coping kind of mechanisms and strategies to rationalize an event, but also teach you how to bet your behavior can help you to recover from the disorder. Also exposure-based therapies, we've spoken about that one previously, quite similar to cognitive behavioral therapy. So putting yourself in a situation where maybe something that you have avoided, which brings on acute stress disorder, maybe exposing yourself to that, then gradually increasing that exposure to try and help yourself, I suppose, recover and put yourself in situations when you can feel more normal. I know that one in particular is common with dealing with phobias as well. You've also got hypnotherapy as well. And finally, medication to relieve the symptoms of ASD as well. So we always recommend whenever we talk on these podcasts that people talk to their GP or a health professional whenever it comes to medication. But the classic ones are there. You've got selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors and also antidepressants as well, which may help with ASD. But one of the ones I think, Matt, that we talk about very often is, of course, self-help and self-care as well.
This is things like, seeking a sanctuary or a safe environment following the traumatic event, things like maintaining a healthy schedule of things like eating, sleeping, exercising, cutting out substances like drugs and alcohol that can be seen as a sort of a form of escapism, but are not actually, helpful in the recovery. And I think following a normal daily schedule as well, things like, getting up, showering, getting dressed, eating regular meals, going outside, doing a bit of exercise. So I think all of these sort of self-help therapies that you can do to just, help you. And it's very difficult at the time. At the time of the traumatic event, it's very difficult to keep yourself into some of these. It's one of the first things to go, but some of these self-help things can really help. It's really interesting as well. You look there about cutting out alcohol and things like that. Actually, it's really funny because I think that alcohol is so readily available, isn't it? And I think it's so easy to go out on a bender when you have a real crappy thing happen, and sometimes that can become really unhealthy for you because it doesn't solve anything, does it? It's kind of, all
it solves it in the moment,
cloudy head,
doesn't it? It's the short-term gain, but the long-term pain with alcohol. It's the drink to forget, isn't it? But people don't, I suppose, in the moment, it feels like a great outlet and a great release, but we know what alcohol can do for your anxiety symptoms in terms of anxiety, the dependency. So in the long run, it's something that's probably, like you say, it's good to abstain from if you're potentially going through something that's causing these symptoms.
Definitely.
On there as well, like just getting up and getting in a normal daily routine and trying to, I suppose, feel that sense of normality again, because we spoke about the symptoms of disassociation and whatnot, trying to make things feel as normal as possible to yourself, eating regular meals, going outside, and getting some fresh air. That can help to just mitigate the stress, potential boredom, anger, sadness, or isolation that people who are suffering from ASD can feel. I suppose it's probably keeping your mind occupied, isn't it? I know for myself, if I'm having a down day, maybe like today with my score of a 5, I know that just trying to keep my mind occupied and trying to feel that little bit more normality can do so much for your mental clarity and your mental health. For instance, like, it's quite a trivial one, but just going into the office with work, it helps you to get rid of that feeling of disassociation because you're having that normal routine of commuting in, maybe talking to some colleagues, and it can do so much in terms of making you feel like you're part of a normal routine in a normal society again. So I think that importance of a routine can't be understated and underestimated at all.
And it's so easy. I think it's one of the first things I think you do. You kind of lose that routine if you go for a stressful event. It can completely blow you out of the water to the point where you can't do anything. And the first thing that you kind of think about is, how do I get rid of this feeling? How do I get rid of this feeling? So it's difficult to try and do these things. Interestingly as well, that it says, we know that, so actually people around the person suffering from from acute stress disorder can actually support them. So actually the main way that you can support someone is by understanding, showing empathy for their distress, and offering themselves or offering yourself as an outlet for the person to describe what happened and their emotions because of it. And I think that that's really important as well, because I think sometimes if you are in a very isolated situation within yourself and you're very thinking inwardly about a traumatic event, actually having someone else around you who can just literally understand you, give a bit of empathy, almost just to listen to you and what you're saying, can be really helpful. And I think it's something that, especially when you first experience a trauma, that having someone else there who can help you is so important. And I think it's something that and I think a lot of people feel very helpless when they know someone who's going through a traumatic event and they don't know what to do. But I think the simplest thing I think that you can do is just listen and just show a bit of empathy for the fact that your situation is, trying to understand someone's situation. There's a lot to be said about that in general, I think, in the world, about where people just don't understand what another, don't try and see it from someone's point of view, but actually just showing a bit of empathy for someone, trying to understand what they're feeling and let them just talk to you is sometimes one of the best things that you can do.
Matt,
I think.
Yeah, that's such a powerful message, mate. It really is, because I think we've all been, well, a lot of us have been in situations, I know I have myself, where someone's confided in me and you do feel helpless. Sometimes when you are listening to this person, you want to help them. The best thing you can do is, like you say, just be an ear, just be a shoulder for them to talk to vent to help them try and rationalize it, because sometimes talking about it and just getting it out there can do the world of good. So you don't need to have to, as a help, you don't need to have to come back with all the best advice in the world. Sometimes it is just being empathetical and listening that can really go a long way. So yeah, that's a great message from you there, Matt. I think a lot of people, people are listening. That's some great advice, really, as a helper to take on board. But yeah, so that was a really nice discussion, actually, Matt. I think I've learned a lot in particular about ASD, and I think the importance of knowing them different symptoms, the causes, and treatment. Being an ear in particular is so important. Is really helpful. So should we do a little recap? So yeah, first and foremost, cheers, mate.
Off you go, Jack. Do a recap.
So we know acute stress disorder, which is often termed ASD, is in the same kind of family of post-traumatic stress disorder, where it can be caused by that traumatic event or something that's happened to someone, whether it be directly or indirectly. And it's where you have quite a short-term development of symptoms that usually don't last that long, but can be quite severe. Whereas PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, is typically where you have a longer kind of timeline in terms of the symptoms that you experience. What causes it? Well, what are the symptoms? We know that they can be grouped into emotional symptoms. We know that also there are dissociative symptoms and some quite nasty physical symptoms there as well that can be quite debilitating, quite hard to manage and deal with. We know that the causes, like we've just said, can be direct or indirect, and they can be anything really that can just cause this onset of symptoms. So it can be very personal to the individual. And finally, we know that the treatments for ASD typically revolve around them psychological therapies and education, in particular cognitive behavioral therapy, exposure therapy, hypnotherapy, and also some medications if necessary. And then finally, like we always are big advocates for, that kind of self-care as well, and getting into a routine and trying to limit substances that can exacerbate any of the symptoms. So that is acute stress disorder, of course, episode 5 of our Anxiety Explained series. And yeah, I think that was a really good discussion, Matt. Really enjoyable one. Brilliant. So if anyone wants to find out a bit more, we've got our articles on the MindKeepers website, and of course keep a lookout on our socials. Have a look at our Get Help page as well on the website, and keep posted for the podcast and the articles to come as well. Super. Well, thanks, Matt. Have a good stag do. Don't go too hard.
Cheers, Jack, and I hope that your number's a little higher tomorrow.
Yeah, it will be. I'm sure it will be by the time we come to catch up next. Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the MindKeepers podcast.
Our purpose is to ensure that anyone who needs help takes the steps to get it.
Break the stigma, take the step.